daunting challenge. No railway company in the world had ever managed to run a train non-stop over 390 miles. But there were aspects of Flying Scotsman's design which would help. The boiler could produce tremendous power. It was large enough to be able to feed 3 cylinders with steam at full pressure and for long periods.
The limitations weren't technical. The locomotives could carry enough coal, they could pick up water en route. The problem was that to ask a driver and fireman to run that locomotive all the way from London to Edinburgh was pushing the limits of human endurance if it wasn't downright dangerous.
Normally, the train would stop at a station and a second crew take over, but this was different. Because the journey was going to be non-stop, a second crew would need to be on the train from the outset.
The problem Gresley had was that you have your first crew here in the cab of the locomotive, you have the replacement crew here in the first coach, and on normal tenders you can't get them across. Gresley's genius was to put a corridor through the tender.
He designs this, and famously he checks it out by putting some chairs along the side of his dining room, and one of his daughters discovers him sort of squeezing along, because he's quite a big bloke, squeezing along behind these chairs. And he says, well, you know, if I can get through here, my crews can get through here.
In great secrecy, Doncaster Works built a corridor tender, and on May the 1st, Flying Scotsman sallied forth from King's Cross on her way to Edinburgh.
It was a momentous day for everyone, but especially for 2 of the passengers.
Well, I met my wife for the very first time on this Flying Scotsman train on the 1st of May 1928. Everybody was fearfully matey and excited about this, and we were being greeted on the way by waving crowds with flags and banners, and all the town bands were turning out. Everybody on the train got most tremendously friendly. And we went to lunch and we were engaged within 3 weeks' time. And so I was let in for 40 years hard labour.
Well, I think that it was 40 years hard for me, not for you, anyway.
To run non-stop from London to Edinburgh, it's a massive piece of coordination. There's over 200 signal boxes en route. You only need one of those signalmen to pull the signals to red, and you stop. And they don't stop.
They completed the 390-mile journey in just over 8 hours, 12 minutes ahead of schedule. It was a world first, and Gresley's stroke of genius was to change the way people travelled, not just in Britain, but across the globe. The non-stop run had been a huge triumph for Flying Scotsman. It had its first world record, and its reputation was growing. The LNER now began to use it to promote the company's profile as fast, efficient, and forward-looking. The man behind the strategy was the head of advertising, Cecil Dandridge. He took up his post in 1928 and set about creating a distinctly modern identity for the company.
One of the first things Dandridge did when he got his new job as advertising manager was to look out for a new typeface for the LNER. Because type really can suggest a very old-fashioned or a very modern organisation, depending on what the type looks like, whether it's serif or sans serif, or, you know, curly or straight, Victorian or modern.
Dandridge went for the modern. He chose a revolutionary typeface, Gill Sans, from one of the most extraordinary designers of the interwar years, Eric Gill. Gill had first used his typeface on a friend's bookshop in Bristol. LNER took the new style to new heights.
I think LNER were making a very bold decision in taking up Eric Gill's very modern typeface, the sans serif. It was like nothing that had been seen before. He was a very strange mixture of the religious and the controversial. He was a risk-taker. He was mad on sex, as one of his friends described him. And by the time that LNER were commissioning Gill, he was pretty notorious in the public domain.
Eric Gill's type was so cool, so modern, so clean, so crisp, so dynamic, that Dandridge thought that's the image for a fast railway. It went on its posters, it went on its timetables, it went on its locomotives, it went on its station name boards, and it looked terrific. Dandridge commissioned superb modern posters, artists like Tom Purvis, Fred Taylor, Frank Newbold. These were some of the great poster artists of the 1930s. And if you look at the posters today, the combination of these really clear graphic images celebrating East Coast holiday resorts or the Flying Scotsman train, combined with Gill's sand lettering, gosh, they look modern even today.
Dandridge and his team were using Flying Scotsman to create a brand based on style and speed. And although they were doing it against a background of the worst economic depression in Britain's history, it worked. Crowds of people would line the platform to take a look at the last word in luxury travel that they could never afford.
It was glamour, style, service. Cocktail bars, cinema, coaches showing newsreels, hairdressers.
A typical meal in the restaurant car might include pea soup, followed by roast turbot or roast mutton, and finishing with cabinet pudding and cheese and biscuits, all served with fine wines at your table.
All this happened on the Flying Scotsman train itself.
By the late 1920s, the public's love affair with Flying Scotsman was well and truly established, and was enhanced in 1929 when the locomotive achieved another first. It was to star in its own feature film.
When you see the Flying Scotsman train racing through a very, what we call today an unspoiled British landscape, it looks absolutely terrific. And you feel, watching it, I'd like to be on board that train. Well, that was certainly what the advertising manager of the LNER wanted you to think.
What the company didn't anticipate was just how the locomotive was going to be used in the film.
The LNER initially give them full access, and they wheel out the locomotive, the Flying Scotsman, and they take over the Hertford Loop to run the train on, so they can do all their stunts and everything else in real time with the real train. Although the LNER aren't too impressed with the actual plot line, which includes at one stage the heroine Pauline Johnson actually climbs out the outside of the train and climbs along the train. It's a scary thing because it's obviously filmed in real time without any stunt people at all.
One of the climatic passages of the film is where the fireman who's been sacked clambers over the tender while the train's moving in a bid to knock out the driver. It was hair-raising, it was scary, and it was dangerous to all involved.
The focus on the locomotive carries on throughout the movie.
Well, the film ends with the driver looking up at Flying Scotsman's nameplate above these huge driving wheels with a tear in his eye, and it goes to show that it wasn't Pauline Johnson or Ray Milland who were the stars of this film, it was Flying Scotsman herself.
Old Bob, the driver in the film, is portrayed as having a very human relationship with his engine. But what was it like in the real world? King's Cross driver Ron Kennedy drove the Flying Scotsman regularly in the 1940s and 50s.
It was like having control of a massive monster. And if you was a good engineman, and there's a difference between drivers and enginemen. If you was a good engineman, you used to talk to it and it would talk to you. I first met this engine as an engine cleaner. Eventually I'd become a driver and was driving the same engine. You may have the wind against you, maybe rain, and the wind made a difference even to a massive engine like this. But you needed a good fireman to produce the steam, because it was a fireman that gave you the power of the steam. And it was controlling the speeds. You had to know the speeds of the track. I mean, it's not, start up and go as fast as you can. There's certain speeds that you're allowed to do. And of course, when we was first working on these things, there was no speedometers. Drivers never had watches to see the time. You had to look at the clock on the station or look at the clock in the signal box as you run past to know the time.
Speed had always been part of the LNER brand, and in 1934, speed was at the heart of Nigel Gresley's plan to use Flying Scotsman for the company's most audacious publicity coup to date. An attempt on another world record, to run at 100 miles an hour. Because locomotives weren't fitted with speedometers, Gresley coupled a dynamometer car to the train. The driver on that journey was a man called Bill Sparshott.
Sparshott apparently said when they left King's Cross station, there were bystanders there, and he said, "If we hit anything today, we'll hit it hard."
Speed started to rise. 80, 85, 90, 95. And just before she reached the station of Essendine and had to slow down, she reached the magic ton. She was the first steam locomotive anywhere in the world to have verifiably done so.
The driver and fireman arrived at King's Cross to a celebrity welcome. Dandridge made sure the press were on hand to record yet another remarkable achievement. It made the front page of the newspapers. The nation was reading about Flying Scotsman, and the nation was captivated. Everyone, young as well as old, wanted to be part of the story.
If you're thinking trains and you don't know everything about model railways, Flying Scotsman rings a bell. I've heard about that. That's the set I want, Daddy. It's a magic locomotive. It's a bit like Apollo. It's a bit like Saturn V. In those days, it was fast travel. In the 20s, there were very few people who actually went further than the town that was next to their village. So going up to Scotland was like going to another world, another universe, quite frankly. Flying Scotsman represented that, so they were able to have a little bit of that sort of travel in their own home with a model.
Models of Flying Scotsman helped spread its reputation across the country. Toy manufacturers like Hornby and Bassett-Loke quickly found the Flying Scotsman became their most popular product. They were manufacturing replicas using technologies similar to those that had been used to build the real thing. The name Flying Scotsman was everywhere. In just 11 years, it had become a national celebrity.
Flying Scotsman was the fastest steam locomotive in the world. It could run at 100 miles an hour. It ran the world's longest distance non-stop train in the world, the Flying Scotsman, from Edinburgh Waverley to King's Cross and back again. It looked wonderful. So it was speed, sensational beauty, record-breaking. How could the locomotive not woo the public?